All right, welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today we are stepping right back into the history classroom to examine a genuinely pivotal era. We're zeroing in on the early 20th century, that exact moment when the modern concept of nationalism in India truly started to forge this massive, united anti-colonial movement. Okay, let's dive right into this. Because the story of how incredibly diverse groups of people who were all experiencing colonialism in their own specific ways somehow came together under a shared bond of oppression is just absolutely fascinating.
So here's a massive question for you. How exactly do you fight an empire without firing a single bullet? I want you to really put yourself in the shoes of an everyday Indian student, maybe a farmer or a factory worker back in the 1910s. You are staring down the British Empire. We're talking about an insurmountable, heavily armed, and deeply entrenched colonial powerhouse. You've got no weapons, no real wealth, and your people are split across massive divides of class and geography. So, how do you even begin to mount a resistance? Well, to understand the answer that literally shook the world, we first have to wrap our heads around the absolute pressure cooker of a situation the population was living under. Section 1, the WWI pressure cooker. Let's take a look at the baseline reality of that time. You see, to really grasp the spark of Indian nationalism, we can't just look at the high-level ideology, right? We have to look at the brutal, everyday baseline reality that was established during the First World War. The war created this brand new economic and political nightmare that pushed everyday people to their absolute limits. The colonial state desperately needed soldiers to fight its global war, so they instituted what was called forced recruitment. This was literally a process by which the colonial state forced people in rural villages to join the British Army. As a student of history, just try to imagine the visceral, widespread anger this caused. Your family members are being dragged away to fight a war that has absolutely nothing to do with you, for an empire that actively oppresses you. It wasn't just some abstract political grievance. It was a deeply personal invasion of village life. But forced recruitment was really just one piece of this awful puzzle. To bankroll the war, the colonial government drastically hiked up their defense spending. And how did they pay for it? Well, through increased taxes, massively raised customs duties, and the introduction of a brand new income tax. Meanwhile, the prices of everyday goods, they literally doubled between 1913 and 1918. That led to extreme, crushing hardship for the common person. And then you have to add in these devastating crop failures happening in many parts of India, which triggered acute food shortages, plus a horrific influenza epidemic that took millions of lives. People were desperate, hoping all these hardships would magically end once the war was over. But they didn't. The lid on the pressure cooker was sealed tight. Moving on to Section 2, the power of satyagraha, a totally novel method introduced by Mahatma Gandhi when he returned in 1915. Into this incredibly volatile, desperate environment, Gandhi brings a revolutionary new method of mass agitation. He proposed that satyagraha is pure soul force. Truth is the very substance of the soul. Nonviolence is the supreme dharma. Now, what's really interesting about this is that it wasn't just a political tactic, It was this profound spiritual and philosophical shift in how we look at human conflict. He was basically suggesting that if your cause was true and your struggle was genuinely against injustice, then using physical force against your oppressor, it was entirely unnecessary. To really grasp this concept, we have to clear up a super common misconception. People so often mistake nonviolence for passive resistance. But Gandhi explicitly pointed out that satyagraha is not passive resistance at all. Passive resistance is basically seen as a weapon of the weak, right? It avoids physical conflict, sure, but it doesn't necessarily try to change the opponent's heart. It can still harbor ill will. Satyagraha, on the flip side, is the weapon of the strong. It requires intense, active engagement. It's all about appealing directly to the conscience of the oppressor through truth. So instead of forcing an enemy to accept defeat by just beating them up, a satyagrahi persuades them to actually see the truth. By completely ditching vengeance and aggression, Gandhi believed this dharma of nonviolence could be the exact thing to unite all Indians. All right, Section 3. Organizing the peasant's struggle. Let's see how this looked on the ground. Because, look, a philosophy is really just words until it actually meets human reality. And Gandhi immediately set to work organizing local communities. He didn't just launch a massive, abstract national campaign right out of the gate. No, he started local. In 1917, he travels to Champaran in Bihar to inspire peasants who are struggling against this deeply oppressive plantation system. Then, the very next year, in 1918, he heads to Ahmedabad to organize a satyagraha movement among cotton mill workers who were fighting for better conditions. That same year, he's standing with the peasants of the Kheda district in Gujarat. These farmers were completely devastated by crop failures and a plague epidemic, which made it literally impossible for them to pay colonial revenues, so they were demanding a relaxation of tax collection. By successfully organizing these very specific local peasant struggles, Gandhi proved that satyagraha actually worked, and that gave the nationalist movement this tangible, unstoppable momentum.
Which brings us to Section 4, the draconian Rowlatt Act.
Now, the British colonial authorities didn't just sit back and watch this momentum build, obviously. They were terrified of this popular upsurge. They were deeply, deeply scared that essential lines of communication, like the railways and telegraphs, would be totally disrupted. So they pushed back hard. In 1919, the Imperial Legislative Council hurriedly passed the Rowlatt Act, and they did this completely ignoring the united, incredibly vocal opposition of its Indian members. This law was beyond draconian. It granted the government enormous, sweeping powers to repress any political activity. And honestly, even worse, it allowed them to detain political prisoners without trial for up to 2 years. 2 whole years. It was just the ultimate overreach of state power. So in response, Gandhi decides to launch a nationwide satyagraha against this deeply unjust law, kicking it all off with a hartal, a general strike on April 6th.
Section 5, the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy. So the crucial point is, we are heading toward a horrific climax.
We now have this classic scenario of an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. The nationwide strikes and rallies were met with severe, immediate clampdowns. Local leaders were rounded up and arrested, and Gandhi himself was barred from even entering Delhi. The tension was just at an absolute breaking point. Put yourself in that historical moment. Imagine the terrifying speed of this escalation for someone living through April 1919. Following that nationwide strike on April 6th, the police in Amritsar fired directly upon a peaceful procession on April 10th. Naturally, this provoked widespread anger and attacks on banks and railway stations. In response to that, the colonial government cracks down harder, imposing martial law, and this guy, General Dyer, takes command. All of this perfectly sets the stage for the incredibly dark day of April 13th. A massive crowd had gathered in the enclosed grounds of Jallianwala Bagh. Now, some folks were there to actively protest the new repressive measures, sure, but so many others were literally just villagers attending the annual Baisakhi fair. They were completely unaware that martial law had even been imposed in the first place.
General Dyer enters that enclosed area, and he doesn't issue a warning. He doesn't tell people to leave. Instead, he intentionally blocks the exit points and orders his troops to open fire directly on this trapped, completely unaware crowd. Hundreds of people were killed. Later, when he was asked to explain these horrific actions, Dyer's stated objective was just chilling. He said he wanted to produce a moral effect, to create a feeling of terror and awe in the minds of satyagrahis. But, instead of quelling the rebellion like he thought he would, this massacre fundamentally and permanently shifted the entire narrative of colonial rule in India. Section 6, A Nation Awakened. Let's look at the immediate aftermath. As the news of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre spread, furious crowds poured into the streets of many North Indian towns. The public's perception of the British state wasn't just damaged, it was fractured beyond repair. There were strikes everywhere, bloody clashes with the police, and outright attacks on government buildings. And the colonial state? They responded with carefully designed humiliation. A perfect historical example of this sheer brutality is General Dyer's infamous crawling orders. Students discovering this are often just totally shocked to learn that satyagrahis were literally forced to rub their noses in the dirt, crawl on their bellies through the streets, and salute all British officers. People were brutally flogged, and some villages were even bombed from the air. Seeing this horrific physical brutality spreading, Gandhi, staying absolutely true to his core principle of nonviolence, officially called off the movement. Which leaves us with a really profound question to end on today. The Rowlatt Satyagraha was widespread, for sure, but it was still mostly limited to cities and towns. And the sheer violence of the colonial response showed that mere protest just wasn't going to be enough. So, with the harsh physical reality of colonial repression completely laid bare, how does a nonviolent movement evolve from just protesting unfair laws into total, widespread non-cooperation with the empire itself? I mean, how do you actually organize millions of people across a vast subcontinent to simply stop participating in their own subjugation? Keep that question rolling around in your mind, because it perfectly sets the stage for the next massive chapter in this history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing the past, and I'll catch you next time.